Hi, Misha here, and we're going to dive into the Type 99 again. At first, this was going to be a short video, just kind of having fun. Then it kind of grew into a guide. That's always how it works with me, but I am who I am, and I do what I do. So I wanted to give an updated version of what I know, what I suspect, and what I don't know about these really neat guns. I got into them a long time ago now, and it's a really fun look. The early war guns are pretty uniform. Mid-war you start to see some changes, and then by the end it's all over the place. They would build well over 3 million in two, let's call it main variants, well maybe three. You have the early guns, the true full-featured Type 99s, then you have the transitional guns, and then for about the last third of production you have what we refer to today as last-ditch guns. And there's a few kind of oddballs and eccentricities we'll talk about along the way too. The Type 99 was built to fire the 7.7 by 58 recessed rim or rimless cartridge, and was pretty much at the forefront of the Japanese Army and Navy throughout World War II, used all throughout the mainland and the Pacific, and of course used to defend the home islands. It never totally phased out the Type 38 and the 6.5 cartridge, but they built more of these than they ever did the 6.5 guns, so it has to be counted for something. With that, we'll just dive in and talk about the beginning. As your grandma told your grandpa, buckle up, it's about to be a long one. The beginning. And the Type 99 began not with a rifle, but with a cartridge. Going all the way back to really right after the Russo-Japanese War, some in Japan wanted a more heavy-hitting round than 6.5 by 50 semi-rimmed Arisaka. In the end, they went from a round-nosed bullet to a Spitzer, which gave them a little more oomph. So things were kind of delayed. But 1920s, things change, and Japan's attitude changed after the Treaty of Versailles and the way they were treated, especially after the Washington Naval Treaty for the Navy and all that. So the invasion of parts of China began, and they began combating 8mm Mausers and others. And they decided that they needed to, again, consider upscaling the rifle to fire something a little more punchy, more penetration, more power. Now, they had been using the Type 92 heavy machine gun since, well, 1932. And it fired a 7.7 by 58 semi-rimmed cartridge, which was essentially a variant of .303 British. So this is where they began, and work was primarily done at Nagoya. They would, at the very beginning, take Type 38s and rechamber them, rework them to fire an updated version of 7.7 that was a rimless round, and these were promising, but they decided for multiple reasons that they needed a new rifle pattern as well. So this work really was underway by 1937, and by 1939 the early finalized pattern of the Type 99 was ready to go. That's what we have here. Now initially there were plans to produce in a long rifle in a carbine form. The carbine form never made it out of testing, at least at this time, although later it'll be revisited. They discovered that the flash and recoil of 7.7 out of a nearly 19-inch barrel, it just wasn't worth it, that they needed a little more oomph. So the carbine became a short rifle variant, kind of based on the earlier Type 38 cavalry rifle that had been employed in China. But the long rifle was still kind of in vogue. So the long rifle had a barrel about 49.5 to Excuse me, that'd be something, wouldn't it? The overall length was about 49.5, verging on 50 inches, with the barrel around 31 inches. The short rifle had an overall length of just over 44 inches and a barrel just under 26 inches, so about a 5-inch difference. And of course there were other changes too, but mainly they had the same features, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, just because this was patterned, tested, and approved in 1939, that didn't really mean that production was underway yet. It would actually not be until spring of 1940 that the first rifles were coming off the production line, and they would begin at Nagoya. And actually, one of the earlier manufacturers set up was Kogio, and yeah, things would go from there. Yeah, I know, I messed up. I meant Toyo, Kogio, not Tokyo, Kogio. Yeah, that's going to happen probably quite a few times in this video. I do apologize. I'll put it in the description. You'll get me. But they began with the so-called No Series, or Series 0 at Nagoya, and Series 35, we'll call it TK, so I don't make a complete jerk out of myself. And that's where we have these first two early variants here. Now, as you know, the long rifle was produced in very limited numbers, especially at Nagoya. Only about 8,000 were built. 30,000 were built at TK, bringing a total of 38,000. And production was over by spring, maybe summer of 1941. So it was a pretty brief run, all things considered. That's because the short rifle was quickly proving to be, like most short rifles are, the best kind of in between here. The long rifle did reduce muzzle flash and felt recoil, but not enough to offset the saved length and weight of the short rifle. And with training, they could work around this anyway. So by mid-1941, production was ramping up at other factories, including Kokora. And we'll get into the factories in more detail later, because 8 to 9 would build these, plus many subcontractors. So let's talk about features and what separates the Type 38 from the Type 99. Now, this is a basic Arisaka pattern, and by that I actually mean the Nambu pattern, the Type 38. And then we use the name Arisaka, same type of receiver, just rechambered. But many production changes and updates were made. The forging for the receiver itself was simplified and kind of modernized for the tooling of the 1930s versus the pre-World War I era. The dust cover was slightly simplified and updated for the new round. And we will start to see some stamped parts as opposed to fully machined parts. Now, when I say stamped, I actually kind of mean sheet steel that's bent into place, at least for some of these. For example, the barrel bands are formed from a stamped component, a sheet metal folded component, as opposed to machined. Similarly, the trigger guard is a piece of stamped bent steel. The floor plate and the cupped butt plate. Now, this butt plate does protect the toe of the stock and kind of keep the two-piece stock together. The two-piece design was retained from the Type 38. This has a lot of advantages. It allows them to use different pieces of wood. It also, because the grain is kind of counter to itself here, gives it a stronger thing. This retains the tangs of the Type 38, but whereas those were machined, these are, again, sheet steel bent into place, so still reinforces the wrist quite well there. And of course, we still have protected front sights, which appeared originally on the carbines, and we still take the Type 30 bayonet. Here's a bayonet on the short rifle. The bayonets themselves were slightly simplified with the straight crossguard. Of course, as the war would go on, they would be changed. Lots of subcontractors. Still very much a long nylon saber style bayonet. Would be very long on the long rifle. So I'd show that there. This is the closest one I had to hand. But it's kind of funny that Japan used the same basic bayonet, at least universal style, since the original true Arasaka in the late 19th century. Now on to some features. Of course, the anti-aircraft sights are well known and sometimes mocked, although less so today than they used to be. Now the standard rear sight was typically marked up to 15 meters, although some factories like Kokora and I think even some of the TKs were up to 1700, so this depends. Overall range was around 2,000 to 2,200 meters. So we have a sliding thing here, and we have these flip out wings. And thankfully it's quite well known today that these weren't as much of a joke as we make them out to be, because these are meant to volley fire on low-flying kind of bombers, biplanes, things they've been encountering in China. So it made a little more sense, frankly. Now note that the rear sight goes up there, but it actually locks here midway. We'll come back to why that's worth pointing out later. The reason we have this extra ladder is actually for the wings, so that they can fold in. Now when it's folded down, you have a fixed battle sight. And again, that's kind of worth pointing out for later on. So you flip it up to use. Also note that the long rifle has a short upper handguard with partially exposed barrel, and the short rifle has a full length, or nearly so, handguard. Of course, another feature we often talk about is the monopod. Just a wire thing here. It's one of those things that I can understand in theory. Not only does it work as a little bit of a support, it also works as kind of a protector for the lower wood and something to brace the gun with if, say, you're on a concrete parapet or something. That way you're not putting your wood directly on concrete, rough surfaces. And it doesn't really make a lot of extra weight for the gun. Note that the barrel bands are screwed in, not spring clips. And another thing, our cleaning rod. Of course, the long rifle here has a very long rod, probably about 28 inches. And the short rifle has a rod that's just shy of 2 feet, 24 inches. And of course, they are originally retained with this button here, spring-loaded button. That's actually replacing kind of a clip on the Type 38, which had a similar removal and retention of the rod. It's actually a good idea instead of having your rod just strictly screwed into your gun. Speaking of the bore, another famous feature. This was the first full production military rifle to come standard with both a chrome-plated face of the bolt and chromed bore, which, yeah, you can understand how that would be very advantageous in the environments that the Japanese were fighting in. They also hand lacquered Hiroshi, the wood, but the metal finish was typical blue. Quite high grade on early guns like this long rifle. Later, they would switch more to what we would think of as a military blue. And even some would have a paint over the blue finish to protect them better from salt water. Typically, these were Navy guns. The only thing I could say, it's a shame they didn't have phosphating technology, because that would have between the chrome bore and the phosphated metal really protected them from the environment, at least by the standards of the time. Another thing you hear a lot about any Arasaka is the mum, the royal chrysanthemum, which is closely by the year Type 99 marking on the receiver. Now this one is slightly defaced, still visible, but it's been slightly slashed out. The reason I'm okay with that is because this is a Nagoya long rifle, and you don't find many Nagoyas. As I said, only about 8,000 were originally made, and this one is an otherwise matching gun. I did have a TK with the full mum, but this one seemed a little bit more desirable to me personally, so I went with it. Serial numbers on these, there's not a ton. Of course, the receiver itself has the series and overseeing factory marking as well as the serial. And then most, but not all, early rifles had a serial number on the front barrel band / bayonet lug. Sometimes it's on the underside, sometimes it's actually on the rear facing side. And then the rest of your serials typically are in your bolt. The safety knob, which does need to be fitted to a receiver, and firing pin. Sometimes also the extractor has a partial serial on it. Now these are just kind of generalizations. Certain factories did things a little differently. The buttstocks have a few factory marks on the underside too, but a lot of those are worn away today. Here's the receiver sides. Again, sliding dust cover. A lot of features. And again, originally a very high quality gun. Chrome lined, hand lacquered stock, quite high grade bluing for a military gun, 5-round internal magazine, topped off by stripper clips, chargers, side sling mounts as a standard feature. It's another difference I forgot today on the long rifle. The sling swivel on the bottom. On the short rifle, we have it on the side. Little things. Just goes to show you how the short rifle was meant to be a universal rifle. So they started setting up production in 1940. By 1941, you had Kokora ramping up. You had Toyo Kogio, which was switching to the short rifle. You had Nagoya, which was switching to the short rifle. And you would have the factory, and sometimes if it was a subcontracted factory like TK, you would have another supervising arsenal mark, Kokora in that case. And those were the three big factories. And they would be assigned series. And a series would be from serial number 0 up through 99,999. So 100,000 guns up to a 5-digit serial. Nagoya started off with a no series, then rolled over to series 1, and so on and so forth. They had the most assigned to them because they were kind of the primary factory. Kokora had series 20 up through around 26 assigned to them, and TK had series 30 up to 35 at least, and probably 36 assigned to them. Now, just because they were assigned, Nagoya is a great example, they had all the way through the teens, doesn't mean they would ever get to them. So it's really easy to identify by a series, which gets into the kanji markings on the side of the receiver. It's a whole thing. It's actually a lot of fun to kind of decode these. But they were in full production before Pearl Harbor, and were intended to fully replace the Type 38. And while Type 38 production would end during the war, Type 99s would only supplement them. That said, they would serve everywhere. Because once they got up and running, they would build quite a few. Actually, Nagoya would build over 1.1 million just of themselves, and estimates for everything and everywhere were up to 3.5 million. And considering they had only built between 2.5 and 3 million Arasakas of all previous types and models, that's pretty incredible considering, of course, production would end in August of 1945. But of course, guns made then look very different from guns made like these. So, yeah, let's dive into all of that good stuff. To quote David Bowie, changes began late 42, 43. The first years of production, aside from maybe the bluing and hand lacquering going down a wee bit, a little more hastiness, things remain the same. Your guns produced from the original No series up through Series 4 in Nagoya, although that gets a little tricky, we'll talk about later with Series 2 and Series 4. They're the early pattern. At Kokora, this would run through from Series 20 through 23. At Toyo, Kogio, you're looking at Series 30 up to about 32. And we'll talk about the smaller factories in a minute, but just kind of using those as touchstones. With Series 5 at Nagoya, we start to see some changes. And here's a relatively early Series 5 to talk about what they first did. The dust cover would remain, but the first thing to go would be the monopod. Easy to take away, removing several small parts. That said, the barrel band was still valid, so while they had the parts with the lug on the bottom, they would continue using them. But some of these, it's not that the monopod was removed, it's that they were never fitted for it. These still have the full-length planing rod, although there was a slight change due to change in subcontractors and the way they're cut. The rear sight would be the same style, but it would lack the aircraft wings. Again, while some could be removed, others just never came from the factory with them installed. Otherwise, the guns, aside from a slight degradation in bluing quality to more of a true military grade, would remain the same. We have the checkered safety, cupped butt plate, and all of that. As we move into Series 6 at Nagoya, the front sight stays more or less the same, and our front barrel band more or less the same. But we go to a different cleaning rod. This is a nearly 5-inch long rod that screws in. There's no button on the bottom. It screws into the stock, and it's used as either a stacking rod or just a sinker for a cleaning rope. Moving back here, though, we'll see a major change to the rear barrel band. We went away from this kind of split-topped to a solid body. No lug on the bottom, and in fact a pretty roughly dressed weld holding it together. Now there are variants where there is still the split top and no lug on the bottom. I've seen a lot of those from Kokora, for example. Now we move to the rear sight that no longer has the spots for the aircraft wings, but it's still the tall ladder type. You can notice that it still locks only about halfway down. At this time, some dust covers may disappear, and we have this new bolt handle, the cylindrical type as collectors call it. Originally we had this plum handle, very elegant, very nice, very easy to grasp. Here we go to the skinnier cylindrical type, although I will say, to their credit, they did make it slightly longer to give more leverage, so that is something. And otherwise we're pretty much the same with a steel butt plate. The lacquering is much more basic, fewer coats at this time, and the bluing is starting to get a little weaker, but still pretty good. Series 7 kind of had the same trend. The front end is more or less identical. In fact, this one has a nicer dressing for the weld on the barrel band than this one. This goes to show you different days. But here we have something quite unique to only the Series 7, the adjustable short rear sight. The reason I keep pointing out before it not sliding up all the way is because you didn't need that. And once they did away with the aircraft wings and they used up their existing other sights, they realized they could simplify this and go to a short pattern versus this long pattern versus this pattern without the wings. We still have the cylindrical bolt handle, but now we have a new checkered, grooved line safety instead of the checkering. So things are starting to change, and dust covers are starting to disappear, at least at some factories. Here are the two style safeties, the earlier checkered style on the left and the simplified line style on the right. These are again only used quite briefly, but I wanted to point that out to you because it is an interesting, cool variation in my opinion. Very flat. While I have a bolt out of the gun, this disassembles the same as on a Type 38. Press in, rotate, your safety comes off, firing pin comes out, and there's a spring inside the firing pin. And that is pretty much it for disassembly for cleaning. 4 large pieces that would be very difficult to lose in the field. This is all essentially one piece except for our moving extractor, but we don't want to take that off, and we would not in the field. They definitely learned their lesson after the Type 30. This is one of the most robust, simple, easy to use, easy to clean bolts in the world, loosely derived from the Mauser. Flipping these over to show you the other side, the early transitional, mid transitional, and I guess we'll call this a late transitional, loosely speaking. Mostly things are still very good at this point. We're in 1943, possibly early 1944, depending on exactly the factory. Again, things just kind of depended on what the factory wanted to do and how they wanted to implement changes. These are all still roll marked Type 99, along with a nicely engraved stamped chrysanthemum, serial match parts, all that good stuff. These are all officially 99s, and again, they were not just made at Nagoya, Kokora, Tokyo. I keep saying that, but it's at Toyo, Kogio, TK made them, and some other smaller factories we'll get to in a minute. So the biggest differences: first, monopod disappears, then AA, wings, sometimes dust cover. At Nagoya, we go to the simplified bolt handle, and we go from the long button retained cleaning rod to the short screw-in sinker type rod. We also simplify the barrel bands quite a bit, but we're still using the standard rear swivel and cupped metal butt plate. All that's the same, but this is kind of where things get even crazier. Now we come to where things get interesting. As I said, 3.5 million of these were built, sort of. At least 1 million were of this variant, known as the substitute Type 99 by the Japanese. We call these last ditch rifles. But the truth is, they were phased in 1944 and were built in some places for almost a year and a half. And from the beginning, the receivers are marked differently. The early one here, we have a full, nicely evenly struck mum with full type markings. On your substitute guns, you have virtually no markings and an interestingly stamped chrysanthemum. They tend to be very deep and oftentimes kind of kilted or off center. They still gave them the serial number and all that, though. The idea with these was that all the shortcuts were cosmetic, and that after the war they could be taken back in and updated with the common features. Again, that was the theory. So the basics are the same. You still have a 5-round integral magazine, the same bolt system, a 25.9-inch barrel, and actually the majority of last-ditch guns had chrome-lined bores. Not all, not at all for sure, but the majority. And they always had the bayonet lug for the Type 30 bayonet. But in almost every other way, they were simplified as much as humanly possible. And this one here is from Nagoya. At least I really hope I grabbed on in Nagoya. There are ways to tell these apart based on features, but since I can't see the markings myself and I'm here alone, yeah, could be making an ass out of myself. But we'll go with it anyway. It'll be fun if I'm wrong. Nagoya began what we would consider substitute 99 production in Series 8. Now, Nagoya would not do Series 9, although they would supervise it. That would actually be carried out by not one, but 2 other factories. Rolling over to Series 10, their full substitute guns, and Series 11 is a full production. So you have 100,000 in Series 8, 100,000 in Series 10, 100,000 in Series 11. And that's typically where we end. They actually did enter into Series 12 the summer of 1945, but we're just getting started. Between 1,000 and 1,100, some say 1,200 pieces were built. So Series 12 guns are very rare. If you find a Series 12, pick it up, even if it has a scrub mun, even if it's a mismatched bolt. So that's Nagoya. Again, they built about 1/3 of total Type 99/substitute 99 production. So let's look at what they did. As you do, beginning at the butt. Looking at the earlier one, you have a 2-screw swivel, and looking at the later one, you have a single screw. Of course, one of the most famous things, they went from the cupped metal butt plate to a simple piece of straight wood butt plate. Interestingly, there's even a variation here. Most were nailed on using 3 nails, but some were actually nailed on with 2 nails. That's probably just they got in a hurry at the factory and forgot, or maybe they were starting to run out of nails. But people actually pay money for a 2-nail versus 3-nail butt plate. I kid you not. Of course, the stock itself is very hastily carved, and the floor plate is more hastily bent. This one still has the somewhat dished-in trigger guard. The mum, we already talked about, it still has the groove for the dust cover, but never was fitted with the cover. We have the cylindrical cocking piece, or cocking handle, and we have the welded safety knob. Now actually the safety was always welded on these, but on earlier guns they would actually grind it and checker it, dress it up real nice. By this point they just left the weld pretty much in the raw, figuring that gave enough texture to let you manipulate it. Moving forward, the stock lacks the hand grooves, the fuller grooves. Then they did enlarge the lug in the cross bolt for strength on the stock. Part of that was they were just using cheaper wood, lower grade wood, and needed it there. Part of it was, just part of improving the program. Another very famous feature, we have a fixed peep rear sight. This is made to emulate the battle sight setting on the adjustable. And this is actually the later so-called long base variant. We'll talk about the previous short base in a minute. And of course we have a short upper handguard cut to match that. We have the continuing of the simplified welded barrel band. The forward part of the upper handguard is now gone, exposing some very gnarly lathe marks on the barrels of many of these guns, as they were very hastily turned out. And of course, whereas this is all one single piece of wood, this is a separate piece, really just held in between the stock and the front. And whereas the original barrel band was screwed on, this is pinned onto the barrel, so it's not really removable, not without tools, and you'd have to re-weld it. Simplified, and of course there's not even a channel for a cleaning rod in these. And then finally, of course, the front side protectors are long gone by this point. The bluing is much more utilitarian, sometimes very grayish, very thin, very light sanding on a lot of the wood on these guns. Flipping over, you can see there's still a two-piece back here, so this is often considered a three-piece stock. Charging handle. The lug protrudes through on this side. You can see the other side of the bolt here and the other side of the pin here. Very standard, not a super light Nagoya, but a good honest example, and with a mum, which is not always the thing. At this point, serial numbers are more basic. The number on the front band is gone, at least on most of these. When it comes to the receiver, most all have serials, but not all. Some late ones, they did not even serialize. And then you get to the bolt. Typically, the bolt still has a serial. The firing pin often does not. Later on you go. The safety usually does, but some late safeties may not have a serial number either. So it's possible to only have maybe 2 serials on a very late Arisaka. Although most, again, had more. So that's Nagoya production. And that's how Nagoya did things. But we have several other factories to talk about. This is where, personally, this gets fun. Here we have final series examples from Kokora and Toyo Kogio. That's kind of what I like collecting, is this early and late. So sometimes I do miss out on some of the mid stuff, and you can go kind of insane collecting all the weird little variations, because while in the early days, yeah, they pretty much followed a similar standard. Even then, there are variations, like in sling swivels or the monopods or the cleaning rods, manufacturing details, differences. But at this point, each factory's kind of doing its own thing. Some will take notes from others, some will not. So here we have a Kokora Series 25. Fun fact, my very first last stitch, in fact my very first 7.7mm Arisaka, was a Series 25, but not this one. They would start off at 0 in their final series and run up through around 92 to 93,000. So almost completing Series 25, meaning late examples from Kokora were built in August of 1945. TK here would run up through Series 35, and they would get into their final batch and wind up around serial number 59,000, give or take. Examples from the late run are interesting, but there's some kind of cool identifying features of each one, different shortcuts they took. Now you'll notice right off the bat, the Kokora and the TK here, sorry, Kogio, still retain the plumb bolt handle. They did not go to the cylindrical. Now, Kokora did kind of simplify it, making it more of a drum shape and kind of having a flat edge, so that makes it identifiable. And TK did their own thing. It is a little more crudely shaped on the end, so they definitely shaved off a few machining steps there. Both still have welded safeties. One thing I note with a lot of late Kokoras, they have a lot of chatter here on the wrist. kind of cool. This also has the straight trigger guard, unlike this one that's still dished in a bit. That's emblematic of them. And then has a further simplified cut, no more rounded edges, just kind of changing angles for the floor plate, the mag. Here we have a rear sight. This one is missing its mum, pretty common. Notice the edges are very squared off on this rear sight, whereas on others they would dress those a bit, like on this Nagoya, angle down. It's just a small little cut, but it does save a little time. Moving forward, we have a pretty rough-hewn upper handguard, especially compared to the Nagoya. And we have a simplified barrel band. If you look here, it's just a screw head poking out versus the one with the kind of the washer around it. The Kokora barrels aren't the most chattery, but they can have some pretty leftover lathe marks. And then the front band is welded on. Front sight is there too. Looking at the Series 35, what's kind of interesting, Toyo Kogio kept a slightly higher standard. They still made a lot of the changes. This has a straight trigger guard. One thing I forgot to point out, they even did away with the kind of recesses in the back here on the Kokoras. This one has the straight guard, but it has a bit of a recess in the back. The bluing's just a little bit smoother, or rather the machining is a little bit higher quality. They still dress the rear sight, actually more so even than on the Nagoya. And as you notice, it still has the finger grooves in the stock. And it still has the kind of washer for the screw on the band. And while there are a few lathe marks on the barrel, it's a little prettier. Just seems like they took a little more time, a little more exposed weld here. It's a little funny because that was near Hiroshima, so we often joke that some very late Series 35s could be glow in the dark. Even the butt plate's smoother, whereas on this one it's very rough. One thing I always find neat about late war guns, when you put your finger in here, you can feel the marks left from the saw blade that cut this 80 years later. Now on the TK, it's much nicer dressed. Actually was sanded a bit. Again, just a little bit higher quality for what it is. Simplified sling swivel. Grooves there. And you can note that Kokora still retained the 2-screw rear swivel. But Toyo Kogio did go to the single screw swivel. Again, each one just did their own thing. Much nicer dressing here on the recess. As far as the actions, they're all pretty well the same. So at the end of the war, I would say that Toyo Kogio was producing the quote-unquote nicer last-ditch guns, and they have a neat history behind them too. But these are the big manufacturers. There were some kind of interesting oddballs and out-of-the-way guns too. Now let's talk about the small fry, the other factories. Probably one of the most famous, just because they built basically 100,000 total in 2 series, was Tokyo Juki Kogyo. Series 27 was overseen by Nagoya, and they would build 41,000 in it. Series 37, still built by TJK, was overseen by Kokora, and they would build 59,000 in it. And a lot of these appear in America, and while many are last ditch, some, especially in Series 37, were relatively early, even having cleaning rods and other features. 27s never seem to have cleaning rods, but some of the earlier ones were actually built on previously rejected or at least leftover full stocks. Some of the Some of the 27s and 37s are really interesting, and it's actually a lot of these that appear with the paint on them that is supposed to have been applied for better saltwater protection for the Naval Special Landing Forces, essentially the Marines. Lots of cool variations in those series. When I was talking about Nagoya, I skipped over Series 9. That's because Nagoya would supervise it, but it was actually constructed by two factories. Izawa would do the first 50,000, and Howa, later of AR-180 fame, would do the next 50,000, so they would split the series between them. In addition, Izawa would actually produce 10,000 guns at the beginning of Series 4. So whereas Nagoya would directly assemble 10,001 up through 99,999 in Series 4, the first 10,000 were from a different subcontractor factory. Another interesting thing, Series 2. Nagoya started off at serial number 2500. I don't know that anyone actually ever built 2400, 999, the first ones, or if they were just set aside for something else. It's kind of interesting. They could have also been set aside for other purposes, for example, trials guns, test guns like the Type 0, which is kind of part of my theory. Either way, yeah, kind of interesting that. Another couple of factories of note, you had Yinsen in Korea. They were originally producing Type 38s and 6.5. They would switch over mid-war to Type 99s in Series 40, building around 91 to 92,000, so not quite completing a full series. One of the rarest is actually Chinese production from Manchuria. The Mukden Arsenal in Series 45 would build 3,000 guns. Again, having originally built and reworked other guns before that. So you have some interesting divisions there, but it goes to show you that the big factories mostly played with the numbers, and these are pre-assigned, so that's why you kind of skip ahead. For example, there was no Series 13 or Series 36 or Series 41. So with that, I've got two interesting very late examples from Yinsen, and TJK, Tokyo Juki Kogio. Each of these have things that make them very unique for collectors. Now looking at the Yinsen, we have a standard 2-screw swivel, standard wood butt plate. We look at the TJK, this is what is known as a rope hole. No swivel, just a hole, and then a butt plate. Now to mate up with that, some of the rope hole guns would have a standard swivel up front. This one does not, no swivel at all. They just would kind of make a slip knot and let the other end of the rope around the front end. So I guess they're saving a little time and energy there. Another thing that you would think would have been more common, but it really wasn't, except on these and some late Nagoyas, they deleted the slots for the dust cover. The dust cover itself was long gone, but they were still machining the slots. With some late Jinsens and TJKs, the side of the receiver is smooth. This one has a standard bolt release. This one has something unique to Series 40 guns, the thumbnail or fingernail release, where they just inletted it in. It's a thicker, blockier one. In some ways better because you don't have a part hanging off, but it mostly was there to, again, save time and effort. Looking at these, the stock on the TJK is pretty typical standard late. On this, we still have finger grooves, although the stock could be a rejected earlier one. One neat feature of Series 40 guns, at least some of them, is they have the short rear sight base, whereas most of your last ditches have the long rear sight base. Only, as far as I know, Jinsen and Nagoya's in Series, well, late 7 and some in 8, use this short base. Then they went to the long base because it actually made a better, more authentic sight picture. You can also see on this how the upper handguard doesn't really line up perfectly. Another interesting thing, this has the horseshoe, the H style barrel band with the cutout on the top as opposed to solid style that we've seen for a while. Could be an older part, could be how it was done. And then we have a very roughly machined barrel. Here's the TJK, much smoother. This is a standard front. This has the unique to Jensen square-topped barrel band, where they just took a piece and welded it on, making it a big blobby mess, basically. But it did its job, I suppose. Flipping these over, you can see this still has the dished trigger guard and the cylindrical bolt handle. Actually, the weld on the safety on this TJK is somewhat dressed. And then you look at the Jensen, and the bolt handle is actually slightly crooked the way they welded it on. Very roughly machined, very hastily machined trigger guard, floor plate. Again, very much a rush job. This one does not have a chrysanthemum. Again, much like with the Series 12, if you find a Series 40 without a mum, still buy it. They're still very much worth it. At least this rope hole does have a mum, so that's nice. Moving on. Notice the inlay there for the lug, and then the barrel band here, barrel band there, and then here's the standard bayonet lug band. Here's that flat-topped style. Yeah, the rushed late war guns to me are very fascinating. And we're not quite done yet. Now we come to an oddball and a bit of a mystery. First though, the Japanese Naval Special Type 99. Talked about it before, talk about it again. Why not? It does fit in here. I nearly did not include it, but I like being thorough. The Navy really could not get enough guns and resources, especially mid to late war. So, at the Yokozuka Naval Yard with the Toyo Kogio, T-O-Y-O-K-A-W-A, kind of inspection, they would build roughly 14, maybe 15,000 of these guns. And there'd be a few variations. This is a pretty early one. Later ones with more last-ditch features. This one still has the adjustable rear sight and full-length stock, but note it does not have sling swivels. What's unique about these is most all the parts are made from cast iron, including the butt plate, trigger guard, and receiver. That's why there's this big step on the receiver. Also note there's no cut for a dust cover. That was actually because only the barrel and the bolt were steel, and the barrel would screw into the receiver and the steel bolt would lock into a barrel extension, kind of like on an AR-15. I'm not even sure the handle isn't cast. There's definitely a seam line here, up here. The safety is decidedly pretty rough, and it has a very simple cast rear sight. Some say these were built using trainer cast parts, and that's probably true. Others just seem to be kind of soft cast iron pot metal parts. Looking at the front sight, there's very simplified holes drilled in it. This is obviously a very cast part. This is cast as well. Again, this is an earlier one. Later they would get the last ditch treatment. And these were nominally safe to fire, as it were, but I don't know how many actually saw use because many were made after the Navy was really no longer doing landings. There's some pits and inclusions on these receivers. That's just because of how they were cast and how relatively unimportant it was. Moving down here, we have a gun, and this very well could be a fake, or not. This is a regular Type 99 last stitch pattern. Look here. But it has the short barrel. Much like a Type 38 carbine, it is just under 19 inches. If someone made this as a fake, they did an awful lot of work to turn down the front of the barrel, press on the front sight, press on and pin on the thing here, cut down this. Here we have our rear sling swivel. What I can tell you, either done at the arsenal level or the armorer level or the field level, they would cut down guns. Sometimes it's because the muzzles were damaged. Sometimes at factories, at the end, they would take one 26-inch barrel, well, 25.9, cut it into two to make two barrels instead of one. So some late war guns that came out had roughly 12-inch barrels, 11, 12-inch barrels. And these have been documented. So technically there were some SBR linked Arasakas brought back. Again, at the end of the war, they were making do with whatever they had. Like I said, I can't promise this is original. You can always assume not. I didn't pay a lot of money for it. But I do think it's quite interesting. And whoever did the work, be it at a Japanese factory or in the USA, did it the right way. And one more flip over just to show you. Again, not much to see with the carbine here, aside from just shortened handguard. Again, if someone did this, they did a good job because the screws aren't buggered up. I don't know. It's one of those mysteries of life. Kind of makes you wonder why someone would do it too and then not sell it for a ton of money. Who knows? Of course, the Naval Special. What's fun about these, I bought this one, and you can sometimes still find them sold as trainers because of the cast iron. Although other times on auctions they are crazy high money. The release for the magazine is a little different. Everything is very crude about these. Oh, there's also a carbine version of this. This has the standard nearly 26-inch barrel. There are some documented with shorter 20, 22-inch barrels, but unfortunately I don't have one to show you. But I did decide to include it in this here video. What do you think? And there we have it, back where we began. It's pretty famous that this action, along with the Type 38, is extremely robust, extremely durable, simple in the good way. And that's what allowed them to simplify as much as they did later in the war and still have a safe-to-shoot gun. Even though reputation is starting to change today, there still are myths about the late war guns. Now, I'm not going to say something made in, say, July or August of 1945 is 100% safe, because quality control testing was pretty much gone at that point. But up until that point, through 1944 and into early 1945, these were still safe guns. No army is going to equip its troops with the gun just as dangerous to them as the enemy. No sane army, anyway. So, despite the crude appearance, yeah, they're perfectly fine. Then that's not getting into trainers and all that. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But I got into these guns before the price was crazy, back in the late 90s, and you could pick up a lot of these quite cheap. Last stitches were almost just being given away. And even guns like the ones with monopods were a couple $100 at most. That was then, though, and the problem then, just as is now, is the ammunition. Some companies, of course, Norma's always made it. A few others make it today. I think PPU might make a run now and again. But getting 7.7 is not the easiest in the world, so that does keep the numbers a little down. One neat thing is most of these guns are not import marked. That's because most of them in the USA are real vet bringbacks. Now, because of how they were kept on ships or whatever, sometimes bolt serial numbers will not match. Just a fact of it. Sometimes they will. Sometimes dust covers will be missing. And sometimes monopods and AA sites could be missing. But very few have been refinished. Some have, of course, been sporterized, but you can tell that from a mile away. But these are very authentic pieces of World War II history. Some of them essentially untouched from Grandpa's closet, or maybe great-grandpa now, and from when he brought one back from the war. Now, the story's always picked it up off a dead Japanese soldier. The reality is probably won it in a card game after the war, or just picked one up, because there were stacks of these, especially last stitches, just laying around post-August 45. Either way, neat guns, and I just really enjoy them. And they're a lot of fun to study. So, if you have any questions or would like to share some unique guns that you've got, please post below. And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And the link to the Patreon is in the description below. This is Misha. I'm tired, so I'll catch you next time.